that something that you want?
Yes. All right, everyone. 11 o'clock. Let's get started. So we're going to continue our discussion of Conway's use of process dissociation. So just to refresh our memories, and I'll return to this just in case you forgot or it was a little unclear the first time. So Conway's method involves giving two sets of 10 parallel dilemmas, which are in a fixed random order. In the first set, the harm in question does maximize the greater good. So like, for example, the torture to find bombs. And in the other 10, the same kind of harm does not maximize the greater good. So that would be the torture to find paint bombs. As far as how the U parameter, or utilitarian process dissociation measure of utilitarianism, here's the way to think about how it's calculated. It's technically different, but take my word for it, this is mathematically equivalent. You'll get the same number if you use this. The paper has a different equation, but it's the same output. It will always give you the same result. It's your score on these minus this. So just to make that concrete, let's say someone endorses harm in 7 out of the 10 first kind of dilemmas, the ones where it does maximize the greater good. So that would be 0.7. They have a 70% chance of endorsing harm in cases like that. And let's say they do 0.2 here, so 2 out of the 10 dilemmas, these type, they endorse harm. They would have a utilitarianism score of 0.5. Just so that's super explicit. If you want to write in this area, another point I'll make, we won't be tested on this, but you'll see this in the paper. So you have to talk about the congruent versus incongruent dilemmas. This is how process dissociation models work. The congruent dilemmas are the ones where the utilitarians and the deontologists should agree. So that would be the second type. So both utilitarians and deontologists should say, don't harm. The really informative one is the incongruent one, where they should disagree. So that's what's underlying the model, but if this gives you a headache, you don't have to worry about it for the test. So last class we looked at Conway's 2013 paper, which is the first place he introduced this model. And in that paper, he found evidence consistent with the dual process theory, where cognitive load reduces utilitarian responses, and increasing empathic concern increases deontology scores, the D parameter, which is how much you reject harm in both types of dilemmas. But the 2018 paper by Conway, which has Joshua Green as a co-author, was written specifically as a response to Kahan's paper. Remember that if you just give people basically these kinds of dilemmas, the first kind where do you harm someone to maximize the greater good, but no process dissociation, you find that, quote, utilitarian responses to these kinds of dilemmas are positively correlated with some bad things like egoism and psychopathy. A one-sentence summary of the Conway 2018 paper is that when you look at the U parameter, or the process dissociation measure of utilitarianism, it doesn't have those bad psychometric properties. It has a much better psychometric profile. It's correlated with good types of measures. So let's be a bit more specific. Give me a second. Forgot to bring up I always have the key terms list open just in case I forget something. I'm just going to get that open. Okay. So in the paper, they have two different things. One is conventional utilitarian versus deontological judgments. So that's just looking at this first one without doing the process dissociation technique. And then they have the U parameter, or the process dissociation measure of utilitarianism. That measure is negatively correlated with psychopathy and negatively correlated with different types of egoism. So that should help Green sleep a little better at night when you extract it this way. Which should make sense, right? Because you're controlling for people's tendency to endorse harm whether or not it maximizes the greater good. So you're kind of getting rid of its association with psychopathy that way. However, and this is one of the motivations for my work that we'll see either at the end of today or on Monday, there is no correlation between the U parameter and endorsement of self-sacrifice in different sorts of ways. So, for example, you give people the Peter Singer drowning child case, which I've mentioned in passing and we're going to talk more about today. So, do you have a moral duty to wreck your clothes to save the kid? There's no correlation between the U parameter and that. Additionally, there is no correlation between the U parameter and Kahan's greater good dilemmas. So Kahan put together a set of dilemmas, not these ones, but ones where you either have to self-sacrifice or show some kind of impartiality. So, for example, helping someone at the hospital instead of your mother if the person in the hospital needs it more than your mother. But about half of those dilemmas involve self-sacrifice, and again, no correlation, 0.02. Before I build on that, I forgot to mention also, the U parameter, the process dissociation measure, is positively correlated with moral identity internalization. So that's endorsing statements like, I'm a good person, I'm honest, and so on. So endorsing the claim that you have moral traits. And perhaps maybe the best news for Green, positively correlated 0.3 with group focus. So that means when you look at these dilemmas, you can ask people, how much do you care about everyone in the dilemma equally? And people who say, yes, I have this group focus, are more likely to have a high U parameter score. So what I think the right way to think about this paper is this provides evidence that the U parameter is a genuinely moral measure. It's negatively correlated with psychopathy, positively correlated with various good measures. But it's still missing something. It is silent on the question of self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice is a very important part of utilitarian philosophy. If you're a committed utilitarian, you should be willing not just to sacrifice others for the greater good, but also your own interest. And so up to this point in the literature, there is no clear evidence on the question of whether System 2 or cognitive reflection leads to utilitarian answers to self-sacrificial dilemmas. Even though Green, in some of his more popular work, has argued for relying on utilitarianism, even in cases where self-sacrifice is required. So we may or may not get to it today, but what my dissertation and the paper I got published in Cognition were about was testing whether there was an association between cognitive reflection and utilitarian responses to self-sacrificial dilemmas. As we'll see, I used the same method, process dissociation, but applied it to self-sacrifice. Before that, though, actually, before even that, any questions about the Conway 2018 paper? Yes?
Sorry, I got kind of lost. There's the U parameter is positively associated with moral traits?
Yes.
Okay. And then the group focuses has a higher score?
Yes.
no correlation between self-sacrifice or the Kahan's greater good dilemmas.
Yes.
And negative correlation with psychopathy and egoism.
Yes, exactly.
That's
Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, what you said is basically everything that's important, but okay. So before getting to my studies, I'm going to go through a few studies that were done before my work that could have led you to make a prediction either way. So the question now is, okay, there's good evidence that cognitive reflection is associated with utilitarian judgments, at least in these other sacrificial cases, but what about self-sacrificial cases? And there's some evidence you could point to on both sides of that. One, which isn't about utilitarian versus deontology, moral dilemmas, but about economic games, is a paper by David Rand. So Rand, this is a nice meta-analysis, and even if you don't write on the same topic, this is a nice paper because it mentions a number of different manipulations and measures, so could be a fruitful place to look for paper ideas. So in economic games, psychologists distinguish between two types of cooperation. Pure cooperation, which is more self-sacrificial, and strategic cooperation, which is more, rational, and potentially beneficial to the self. We've already seen an example of this, which is the prisoner's dilemma. That's one that we did in class. So in the single game version, where you're just playing with someone once, if you do the nice thing there, that would be pure cooperation. Because the most strategic thing to do in the single game, if you're just concerned with yourself, is to defect. So we saw that in a prior unit. But in the multi-game version, if you, yes?
Sorry, are strategic and pure exclusive of one another? Or can you...
This is say against strategic and what?
So is it about the motivation behind it that counts, or whether or not it is actually useful?
Good. So strictly speaking, it's in terms of what the rational thing is to do, at least from the point of view of self-interest. What this paper says is, especially in the case of pure cooperation, empirically it is associated with, well, I guess, actually I retract that point, that's somewhat tangential. But yes, so to answer your question, it's defined in terms of whether or not the decision is rational, does lead to a better payoff, rational in kind of economics terms. So anyway, so in the prisoner's dilemma, if you give in the multi-game version, that is strategic cooperation, right? If you defect, the other person is likely to defect as well, and then you're both worse off. So that's one example. Another one that's more, I think, easier to understand, and in this paper, most of the studies in the meta-analysis use this one. And that's the public goods game. This is one that I also used in one of my studies. So there's a common pot, kind of public goods. Let's say there's 4 people. You can do it with more, but often do 4. Everyone is given a certain amount of money, or if your lab is cheap, like mine was, you give them tokens that they can use to enter into a raffle at the end, but whatever, some kind of unit that has some relationship with money. Let's say it's $100, $100 each. You then each choose, and you can be on a computer, but it's set up so that you don't know how much the other people are giving. You can give into a common pot, which is then multiplied by 2 and divided evenly with the rest of the group. So, again, there's a distinction between the single game and the multi-game. In the single game, from a kind of economic, rational agent point of view, the best thing to do is to give nothing to the common pot and just hope that everyone else gives a lot. That's the sort of best case scenario for you. But if it's so giving in the single game version would be pure cooperation, right? It's more genuinely self-sacrificial. But giving in the multi-game version, as in the multi-game Prisoner's Dilemma, is construed by Rand as strategic cooperation. Because if you don't give, let's say on the first game, well, slowly people are going to stop giving once they get the sense that no, because you do see after each time how much people gave. So then the giving will die out, and then you won't reap the benefits of the common pot. So that's what pure and strategic cooperation mean in these different types of economic games. So then the question is, what drives different types of responses? And this is relevant to the kind of dual process model. So they have different types of manipulations designed to test what drives different types of giving. And the punchline, which I'll say now, is that increasing the extent to which people rely on intuition out, so you have pure cooperation and strategic cooperation. And the first kind is increased by intuition. When you make people rely more on intuition, you get more giving in, say, the single game version of the public goods game, which is taken by Rand as evidence that our kind of first response is to be nice and cooperative, but we can override that with deliberation if necessary. So how do they test this in the in the meta-analysis? So one manipulation is time constraint. So you can make people rely more on intuition by rushing them, so you have to make the decision quickly. Another is ego depletion. Maybe take this one with a grain of salt. The ego depletion literature has been hit pretty hard by the replication crisis. So, but this is some kind of task where you make people use self-control. And the idea there is you kind of tire out their self-control capacities, and then they aren't able to deliberate as much. A more straightforward way, you don't have to know this, the terms and the key terms, but I won't use this term elsewhere, but induction, which basically just means telling people to use intuition or deliberation. So, when playing this game, go with your gut. Or, when going with this game, think carefully. And then last one, which you've already seen, cognitive load. You give someone some complex thing to memorize, so their system 2 or reflection is distracted because it has to, hold these 7 digits in mind or something like that. So these are different methods you could think about. You could include them maybe in your hypothesis or research proposal if you find any of them interesting. But again, the punchline is intuition increases pure cooperation. So, for example, giving in the single game version of the public goods game. Okay. Any questions about the Rand paper? Okay. Another one, which I won't spend too much time on. Rand was the second author on this one. This is the Bear 2016 paper. So don't stress about this particular reading. It involves an analysis I'm not prepared to, explain in great detail. It uses what's called evolutionary game theory. So evolutionary game theory is a way of mathematically modeling which types of strategies are more evolutionarily advantageous. So you can represent a kind of competitive game between different agents and have a kind of way of measuring which agents pass on more of their genes, and then look at which strategies lead to more reproductive success. And so they used the prisoner's dilemma, and it's often used this way, as a way of modeling cooperative type games, where you can cooperate or you can defect, right? Just like we did. And as I said in that unit, this is a nice example because it's similar to a lot of real life cooperative games, where if you defect but the other still cooperates and is still helpful, you benefit more. But if you both defect, then you both kind of miss out. So what they did is they built into their model that deliberation is more costly, which is true, right? To have those big frontal lobes that are capable of thinking carefully about what to do, it's more metabolically costly. Intuition is cheap, which is why we often rely on it, right? Evolution is cheap too. If there's a shortcut, the brain is metabolically expensive, so intuition is useful. And the punchline of this paper, which again, you don't have to know the exact way that the model works, is that there were only 2 strategies that were viable in this economic evolutionary game theory model. Now this is not definitive. These models often have very simple agents. It may be that in the real world there's more going on than this, but at least in their model, intuitive defectors, so these are agents that just defect they just go with their gut and just defect. Or dual process cooperators. These are ones that intuitively cooperate, so their kind of gut reaction is to be nice, but they can cheat or be selfish through deliberation. So they can look at the situation and go, maybe in this case it's better to cheat, and then do so after using deliberation. In other words, the ones that only cooperate or tend to cooperate after using deliberation, that is not a viable strategy in this evolutionary game theory model. That's consistent with the meta-analysis we just saw, where intuition tends to lead to cooperation in these types of cooperative games.
What was the name of the second category?
This is Bayer 2016.
No, the second category.
Dual process cooperators.
Oh, okay.
So intuition makes them cooperate and be nice, but deliberation in some cases will make them defect. So these 2 papers, along with some other considerations, led me to initially predict that in the case of utilitarian self-sacrifice, it would not be system 2 that caused it, but system 1. So I was predicting, in other words, that Green would be wrong when it came to utilitarian self-sacrifice. But to be fair, I'll put some evidence on the table that may have pointed in the other direction. So it's a genuine kind of debate where there was some evidence pointing in both directions. I was leaning one way, but there was some evidence going in the other direction. To explain the evidence going in the other direction, I'm going to start by talking about the Singer article. I've already mentioned this a few times. So this is the one where and we'll have a discussion about this. It's the first discussion topic of the day. So 2 situations. One, you're walking to work, expensive clothes. You see a toddler drowning in a shallow pond. The only way to save them in time is to wade into the dirty pond, ruin your expensive suit. So show of hands, who thinks that it is morally wrong to not save the drowning toddler? So virtually everyone. So then, of course, you all know where this is going now. So you all could, we all could, well, I shouldn't presuppose how much money we all have, but the cost to save a life in the third world is a few $1,000s. So the cheapest way is the Against Malaria Foundation. They make bed nets for the third world. They're like $5 a piece. So it's for kids to sleep under. And they don't get infected with malaria. Now, it's not as though every single kid who has the net was going to die of malaria. So if you do the math, it works out to a few thousand for every life saved. But we still go on expensive vacations and so on. I mean, we're students, maybe we don't do that. But so the question is it morally wrong for someone who can afford to save a life in the third world to nonetheless spend money on vacations or whatever? Show of hands who thinks yes, that is morally wrong. 1.5. So the first discussion topic, what is the morally relevant difference between the two cases? Between failing to ruin one's expensive suit to save the kid in the pond and spending money on luxury goods when they could be spent on saving a life? Break into small groups and discuss.
Suits that you're wearing, they're like $500. God.
Okay,
Just red
so
one.
some groups are going quiet. What did we come up with? What are some different thoughts that different groups had? Yep.
I think like for the suit one, like your inaction, you can see that you're directly like killing the child, like you see it happening. Whereas like with the donating one, you have no idea like which child it's going to like not donating if it's actually going to kill them or just like not benefit them as much, so you don't like I think like see the exact details of it happening.
Right. So in one case you can see the death right in front of you. The other, it's far away. If I was playing singer's advocate, I'd be inclined to say that that's probably psychologically relevant to why we feel differently, but it's hard to, upon reflection, say, no, it morally matters how far away the death is from me. But interesting point. Other thoughts? Yeah.
You'd probably actually get arrested in like the first case if you didn't help the child.
Yeah, there's a great Seinfeld episode about this. I don't know if any of you watch Seinfeld, but I don't know if this is true, but at least in the state they were in the show, there's a Good Samaritan law where if you fail to help someone, when you could easily do so, you do get arrested. They see someone getting mugged and they film it and make fun of it, and then they go to prison for it. It's a great episode, but that's an aside. Although, again, to play singer's advocate, he's probably going to want to make a distinction between what's legal and moral, but yep.
Oh, I was just gonna say that like if you're donating to a charity, it has to pass through so many hands and so much, and really, like logically, you have no idea that money is actually contributing to anything, right?
Good, yes. So this is one that commonly comes up, and there's two annoying singer responses Singer would give. One is, it's a philosophy seminar, imagine you could know for sure it will help. The other response I would say is there are cases of charities that are very well vetted that like you could be confident, but even then you couldn't be certainly as confident as you can be in the case of the kid. Like it's there's a difference between 95 and 99% confidence. Yeah.
I don't really know where I'm going with this, but if other people see you choosing not to help the child, like within your physical reach, does that also then endorse them the permission that they don't have to help other people in their immediate vicinity?
Good. I've actually never heard this before. That's interesting. So no one around you knows whether you give money to a foreign life-saving charity, but people do see you whether you help the kid or not. So then that could lead to bad consequences. I guess, yeah, the annoying thing they could say is, pretend you're alone or something.
For like drowning child, you could be the only person passing by, so it becomes like their life is in your hands. But for like
Good,
a charity, if anyone could donate, so you could just rely on someone else to do it.
A little diffusion of responsibility, but used in yes. Okay, yep.
I think in this second scenario, you have it's sort of a set of calculations of like, okay, what's going to save a life for X number of dollars. You have a problem of maybe there's a different charity or a different thing you could do that would use fewer resources and also save a life. And so you have a calculation issue where there's an impossible calculation to know what is the place in the world that has my best return on lives saved per dollar. And so I think because of that, in order to avoid impossible calculations, you have to draw certain rules of about how you're going to, or what you should do morally. I think it makes sense as a rule to keep it in a closer context to you in terms of what you should do more.
Right, so this sort of relates to the certainty point that someone else brought up. When you give to things or self-sacrifice on behalf of things that are closer to you, you can have more confidence that it's doing good. There's similar responses that one could make, but yeah.
Maybe there's like an overwhelming amount of like third-world children versus it's just the one child that you could save.
Right. Does that, I'm trying to think, does that matter more? I mean, yeah, would it be different if there was like 1,000 kids drowning in the pond? Would that mean, oh, well, now I no point in helping, so there's 1,000.
Well,
but
let's say
anyways,
the
so
Flash.
we could talk about this all day, of course. So I think at least we see that it's difficult to point to an example that not just psychologically explains why we feel differently about it, but why it's morally different, the two cases. So hopefully this gives you something to think about. But this leads to some empirical work on the side of suspecting that utilitarian self-sacrifice would be associated with System 2, and that's the work, this is in the Green 2013. So this is Green's book, Moral Tribes, which is a great book. I have 3 different sections from it throughout the course. By the way, there's some things underlined in it. Just ignore that. It's a ebook where those are clickable links to like footnotes and stuff like that, but there's no significance beyond that to the underlines. So here he summarizes the work. Yes.
Sorry, are we skipping Singer?
Yeah. So Singer is the reading where he first put forward this drowning child case. You should know the drowning child argument. I mean, don't worry about like the 1 and 2. It's to help you read through it if you're interested. I would say the only things you need to know from that are, so what the drowning child argument is, and that he used this to argue for the moral irrelevance of distance. Right? His point, or at least I should say it's an assumption built into his argument, but the idea that the fact that a child is further away from you doesn't make their life have less value or mean you have less of a duty to help said child.
Evolutionarily it does, doesn't it?
Right, so evolutionarily it would, as would genetic relatedness, but we'd want to maintain that there's a distinction between what's evolutionarily advantageous and what's morally good. Right? Probably we have all sorts of tendencies given to us by evolution that we, upon reflection, would not want to endorse, right? Like tribalism.
Yeah, but the evidence suggests that morality is an evolutionary construction, right? So
No, of course,
really.
or at least this is a very important point. So our basic moral intuitions, I think, and most naturalist type philosophers and psychologists do think is at bottom a product of evolution, but that's not the same as saying every trait that we get from evolution we should morally endorse, right? We can take the moral impulses we have from reciprocal altruism, etc., and then build on them through reflective equilibrium. And it may be that at the end of that process, we decide that there are some other traits we have, like tribalism, etc., that we don't want to endorse.
I'm not saying it should affect, I'm saying it's not, I don't think he should say it's irrelevant.
Oh, good. So when he says irrelevant, he doesn't mean irrelevant to moral psychology. So that's a good point. He means irrelevant to, as a matter of what we morally should endorse. So yeah, that's the way to think. So good pushback. That's the right way to think about that point. And by the way, you don't have to agree. Like, this is what Singer argues. You could say, you know what, Singer is wrong, as many people do. So anyway, so Green, along with a graduate student, and I think this actually came up in the 2015 paper as well, found that the best predictor of a perceived duty to help is just physical distance. And someone asked about this, just to make this more concrete. Literally, if you're vacationing in Uganda or Sudan or wherever, and you get the letter saying children are dying of malaria, you can save them by giving to this charity. If that exact same thing happens in, Kansas, and you get the letter in the mail, you are much less likely to help, even though you're still just giving it to the charity, or even giving online and then it goes to them. So literally just being physically farther away is the best predictor of the perception that you have a duty. And that should seem strange. So it's none of the stuff about certainty that the charity is good. It could literally be the same charity, but just because you're physically closer, it feels like you have more of a duty to help, which is difficult to, upon reflection, say, yes, move the kid away from me, and I have less responsibility to help. And so here, Green draws out an analogy with the trolley problem, right? Where there are these kind of situational variables that give you a certain emotional response to the problem. So in the trolley case, if you're laying hands on someone, it just feels more wrong than if you are pulling a lever, even if it's a lever to drop the person in front of the trolley. So it's the same kind of thing, but the laying on of hands makes it feel more wrong, just like in the self-sacrifice case, it feels more wrong to not help the kid right in front of you than it does to not help the kid, far away in sub-Saharan Africa. In this paper, Green also makes a normative point. This is not as relevant to introducing my paper, but he has a nice idea. He calls it the ideal utilitarian diet, or moral diet. Just see if I can find the exact place. He has a funny line. Yeah, so he was at a talk by a philosopher, and a philosopher was kind of defending Singer's argument, just as we saw, the drowning child argument. And he was giving this talk with a laptop, and someone in the audience said, "How can you give that talk? That laptop could save 3 lives in sub-Saharan Africa, or 2, or whatever, how much laptop, probably not that many, but how can you justify having that laptop?" And the utilitarian philosopher said, "I can't, but at least I have the decency to admit that I'm a hypocrite." And so what Green says is, look, even if we accept the validity of Singer's arguments, we are still human beings and are incapable of kind of living up to that ideal. Just as in the case of health, we may recognize certain foods are better for us, but you can't never eat cheesecake. I mean, some people manage to pull it off, but really, you're never going to eat cheesecake? Is there even a point in continuing to live? So what you do is, you go on a diet, right? You eat better, recognizing you can't eat perfectly. So Green makes a similar point with regard to living ethically. But the empirical point that matters is that, as with other, yes, sir.
Does that run into ought implies can problems though? If you're saying that, oh, we're all human, we can't be utilitarians, well, how can you say that we should be utilitarians?
Yes, I think that's a way of seeing it. Yes, you can't. It would be wrong to kind of wag your finger at people and say you really should do better if what you mean by do better is give everything you have until you're at the same level as someone in sub-Saharan Africa, because no one's going to be able, very few people at least, are going to be able to do that. So what we should morally encourage people to do is what's attainable, this kind of utilitarian diet where you do better than you did before, but recognizing the kind of limits of human nature. But as I was saying, so the empirical point that matters here is in both the other sacrificial case, like the trolley type problems, and the self-sacrificial cases, the non-utilitarian answer seems to be driven by morally irrelevant factors. This provides some reason for suspecting that the utilitarian answer to these kinds of dilemmas might be more driven by reflection. But that's a very tentative link. So this is where my work comes in. To my knowledge, up to my work, none of the work directly tested whether there was a connection between reliance on cognitive reflection or System 2 and utilitarian responses to self-sacrificial dilemmas. Now, I will tell you now, to avoid the appearance of being, self-aggrandizing, none of the terms in the two readings from me will be on the test. But you could use them in one of the written. But you don't have to. There will be other options for the written question that I'm referring to. But if anything in my reading gives you a headache, you don't have to memorize it.
You should just make the whole test your writing.
The whole test, yeah, that would be peak.
Just force everybody to like memorize
Psychopathy
the
or
whole thing.
narcissism. Yeah. So again, to avoid the appearance of narcissism, I will not do that. So here's the punchline. In my master's, I just used straightforward, self-sacrifice cases and looked to see if there was a correlation with cognitive reflection, and there wasn't. So in my master's, I argued that Green was wrong when it came to utilitarian responses to self-sacrificial dilemmas. But for my PhD, I did a series of experiments that used process dissociation to extract a measure of utilitarian responses to self-sacrificial dilemmas. And then the evidence was very much in line with Green's argument. So my PhD was basically arguing that my master's was wrong and Green was right. So that's the punchline. But in the remaining time, I'll at least get started on explaining how my studies work. So remember in Conway's model, there's the 10 dilemmas where harm maximizes the greater good and where the harm does not maximize the greater good. And then you subtract this from this, so this minus this, to get a utilitarian parameter. So I did something similar where you have dilemmas where self-sacrifice maximizes the greater good, and cases where self-sacrifice does not maximize the greater good. So to make this concrete, you can look at the appendix to see all, and as with Conway, there's 10 of each. And I gave all of these dilemmas, all 40, in a fixed random order. And then you can extract various measures. So, but in the self-sacrifice case, just to give you a feel of what this would look like, in one of the dilemmas, you're driving a car beside a cliff, and you're about to hit 5 people who are your age. Your brakes are busted, you can't stop in time. Your only option to save them is to turn off the cliff. So, do they endorse self-sacrifice in that case? In the other case, you're driving and there's one old person, someone who's significantly older than you. Now, if you're a cold, calculating utilitarian, your life matters more than his does. There's more years of happiness left. So in that case, do you think you should turn and drive off the cliff? So as with this one, let's say someone endorses the utilitarian option here or endorses self-sacrifice here in 8 out of the 10 dilemmas, but only endorses self-sacrifice here in 2 out of the 10. This minus this, they would have a utilitarianism score of 0.6. So now this may be somewhat irritating, but if you want to follow my paper, but again, you don't have to memorize this. For the sake of clarity, and then remember in this case it's the same kind of idea, I called the utilitarian parameter from Conway the other sacrificial utilitarian parameter, so OU. So if you see OU parameter in my paper, that's what it's referring to. This is a willingness to harm others, but only when it maximizes the greater good. And then there's the D parameter, which is the deontology parameter. So in his model, that is saying the tendency to say harm is wrong in both cases. So then in mine, there's the self-sacrificial utilitarian parameter, which is calculated in a similar way, right? You tend to endorse self-sacrifice, but only when it maximizes the greater good. And then the last piece is the altruism parameter, which is a tendency to endorse self-sacrifice in both cases. So, even if it's an old guy and, there's going to be more happiness if you just keep going and hit him, you still say no, drive off the cliff. So those are the 4 measures used in my study. Any questions about those 4?
Can you distinguish between OU and SU really quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. So OU, other sacrificial utilitarianism, is a willingness to harm others, but only when it maximizes the greater good. And then SU, self-sacrificial utilitarianism, a willingness to sacrifice yourself, but only when it maximizes the greater good. So we're almost out of time. So the punchline that I'll spell out more next time is the cognitive reflection test is positively correlated with both SU and OU, but not with D or A. So in other words, it's correlated with both of the utilitarian measures, and instructing people to rely on reason in experiments, you have like 2 conditions, increases people's SU and OU scores. I'll spell that out in more detail next time. See you all on Monday.